My name is Brian Griffin, and I'm here to have a conversation with my old friend David Morse at his home in Bellingham, overlooking Bellingham Bay. We're going to talk about David and his family and his growing up in Bellingham. So, David, tell me, let's start at the beginning. Well, let's start before your beginning. When did your family come here?
Well, my father came here in 1884, and as you know, he started a little hardware store down on Elk Street, right where the business is located today, or it was until we sold it a couple of years ago, sold the property. And he and his family, Cecil was 1 year old when he moved here, and they lived above the store.
His name was Robert.
Robert I. Morse.
And where did he come from?
And he was born in Waterville and raised in Waterville, Maine, on a farm. And that was poor country. And his mother saw a much greater potential for him in the future somewhere other than on that farm. And as they used to do, they saved a few pennies and nickels when they could in a cookie jar. And when she had enough money, when he was 19 years old, she sent him to San Francisco alone.
Wow.
But there was an aunt living in San Francisco, and her husband ran a little paint store. So that's where he got his start. He learned about Seaholm through P.B. Cornwall. Cornwall had extensive holdings up here, mine, and later a major mill where eventually Blodell Donovan was. And he met Cornwall on the waterfront down in San Francisco. As a result of that acquaintance, Cornwall asked him to come up here and look at his holdings. In 1883, he made a trip here with the Cornwall's intention of having him become his manager of his store, which he had here, and his holdings. But my father liked the idea, but he went back, took all of his savings, and liquidated a lot he'd been buying, and moved here in 1884. Arrived here around April 15th.
How old was he?
He was 19 when his mother sent him to California. So he would have been 24 at that age when he came up here. Mm. So it was a meager start, but he had lots of ambition and wasn't afraid of many hours of work a day, and built the little business profitably, relatively fast, I think, because in 1884, to a 17.5-foot frontage of that little building he rented, he built that large house in 1897.
Wow.
And that was an expensive venture.
3 years, and he built that big, it's still there.
Still there.
A wonderful old Victorian that's now a bed and breakfast on
That's
4th
right.
Street? Garden Street.
On Garden Street.
What's the address there?
That's 1014.
Okay.
It's just across the street almost from the Presbyterian Church. So that would have been just 13 years to accomplish that. So I got to respect that as making headway pretty fast.
I would think so.
Yeah. Just to continue, so you understand the background of my family a bit, then we'll get on to my personal self. My father's first wife her name was Etta Fowler, and they had been married 2 2 years before coming up here. 2 or 3. They lost one child at childbirth. One child died just a few months old, and then Irving, which his name was Irving, died when he was 16, and he was in high school here, and that was a tragedy. It just broke that family. But of course there was Cecil and Charlie, and they survived. And you know those names. Cecil was the older, and my father groomed him for the take over the business. And those things wore on Etta, and she died about 1907. My father met my mother, and they were married in 1909. So there were the 2 half-brothers that have been a whole generation older than myself. And most people think that Cecil was my father, because Cecil was well known in the community. And I still get that, and I can tell some people of that, and they still think that Cecil was my father.
So Cecil and Charlie were full brothers.
They were full brothers.
Okay.
Yeah, and you knew Charlie's family, I guess, because you knew Shirley and Betty.
No, I didn't know Shirley and Betty, but I remember where he lived, and I knew Olive.
Oh yes.
His wife at one point, or one of his wives. And I think I remember Cecil. Would I remember Cecil?
I would think
Hi,
you would.
Brian.
Well, hello, for goodness sake.
Yes, yeah.
Well, here's my
Thank you.
wife.
Oh, goodness. Here's Joyce. I'll have a cookie. She's bringing us beer and cookies.
You
Wonderful.
wish it was beer.
Whoops. Oh, it looks like beer.
Do you
It's
feel
bubbling cider.
Do you
That's
feel
right.
like something?
Joyce, come right around this way so that you show in the camera for this moment.
Oh,
Get your face right down. Get your face right down next to David's. Would you?
no, you sip it.
Good.
Just for your information, we're going to be married 70 years in
Wow.
August
That's wonderful.
of this year.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Joyce.
That's
Here.
quite a while.
That's quite a while.
Uh-huh.
Well,
You didn't get Edgar in the picture.
maybe we'll get him in later.
Well, now,
Oh, that's good.
I'll tell you, I think I have to put it up here.
Oh, I'll put it up here.
He's going to be in it. Of course, he can get it up here too, you know.
Edgar's going to cat.
He's taught us a lot in the time and passion.
Watch the leg there. Okay. Great.
Okay.
So that
Thank you, Joyce.
kind of gives you a thumbnail sketch of our,
I'm going out, David.
very well.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Bye, Brian.
Thank you
You
very
can
much.
have him all to yourself.
Okay.
I might add to complete that picture, I had 2 brothers, both older. Bob was born in 1910. William was born in December of 1911, and I was born in June of 1913, so there was just a year and a half between each one of us, 3 years between the oldest and the youngest. So we were, the 3 of us boys were raised in that large old home,
Your brothers' names were Bob and
and William,
William.
yeah.
Well, we'll have to get to what happened to them in a moment. But
Yeah.
let's go back to your mother.
Yes.
Was she a Bellingham girl?
My mother came from Nova Scotia, of Scotch-Irish descent, raised on a farm, of course, and it was a large family of 12 children, and most of them survived to regular adulthood, and they all moved west. Just today, Joyce was asking me about that family, so I was reviewing it. I knew most of them. But what brought them west was that her aunt married B.K. McKelman, Now, B.K. McKelman was a Presbyterian minister, and he came into the Northwest here as a missionary and started several churches in southern British Columbia and in Bellingham. He started the first Presbyterian church. And its first church was at the corner of High Street and Maple. That building is still there for a different purpose now. So with him here, it brought others. And she had one brother who moved into Rosedale, British Columbia. Another one came into Whatcom County, and he was the manager for A. McRae Smith's farm out by Linden for many, many years. And then there were two brothers in California, and I had met those because my mother took us on a trip in 1923 to California, and I had met those two uncles. They both worked in the Durant automobile assembly plant down there. So that's how they happened to come west. Well, my mother came to San Francisco because that's where she had a sister who was a doctor down in San Francisco. And then how she happened, well, she came from San Francisco here because of Uncle Mac, B.K. McKelman. And that's how my father met her.
And what was her maiden name?
Oh, I should have given you that. Her name was Ada Margaret Chisholm.
Chisholm.
Chisholm. Good old Scotch name.
One of 12.
One of 12,
My
right.
goodness.
Yeah.
They really had kids in those, had families in those days.
They sure did.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So you were born in 1913.
13.
And in that house, and your father was working in the business, and you grew up. How did you live in that old house until you were a young man?
Brian, I was born in the upper room of that house. In the bedroom, it's now a bed and breakfast, as you know. But I look at that room every time I visit there. Whenever our daughter comes out, we put her up there.
Ah.
And we do that for guests because we don't have a guest room here. And so we've just put people up there, and it's kind of nostalgic, and it's a nice setup. Yes, I'd like to tell you that I've had a happy life. And I was fortunate for my heritage, raised in a Christian home, and the values of moral integrity were not preached dogmatically to us, but they were brought before us all the time in our daily life, and that's had an imprint. And I have nothing but happy memories of my childhood. We were comfortably fixed financially, and had a big home to live in, and a mother that devoted herself entirely to her family. She was widowed when I was just 6 years old. My father died in 1920. And rather than, remarry or live a life more for her own pleasures, her life was devoted to raising us 3 kids. So I've got great respect for that. But she made it a happy place for us. And we were given good liberties, but on the other hand, she had to know where we were at all times. And as a result, she would rather have the kids come to our place to play rather than not knowing just where we were playing with someone else. So when we were real little, we used to have great times playing in this playroom that my father had built for us. Then when we were in grade school, every day after school in the spring, about half of Seahome came down to our place and we played baseball.
Ah.
And we'd knock out a window about once a week. My mother never complained. You could replace a window, imagine, in those days for $2.50.
Yeah.
But that $2.50 was worth quite a bit too.
Did you have a yard beside the house?
That we had a yard beside the house. You remember the Page family. H.B. Harry Page was the principal stockholder and president of the Northwestern Commercial Bank.
Oh, sure.
And they lived next door. The house that they lived in was built by J.H. Blodell, and that's where he raised his family until they moved to Seattle. And then in the corner house was the Montague home. So there were these three big homes in a row, and then next south of us was the Lobby home. He had the Lobby Hotel here and other real estate. And then there was this vacant lot, and then on the corner was Dickinson. Now that name wouldn't mean a thing to you, but he was quite a mover and shaker in his day. At one time he owned that well-known hotel in Portland. I'm sorry, I missed the name for the moment. Anyway, a fine hotel down in Portland. He, I think, lost it during the Depression. But there were those big homes, and
they were full of kids too, I suppose.
The Page family had 2 children. The Montague children were just a whole age older than us, so we didn't have any real contact there.
You went to grade school though, up the hill at the old Seahome,
At the old Seahome
which is
school.
on Indian and
It's on High Street and Laurel.
yes.
Yeah, it's just really a block, almost just above.
And it was torn down years ago. And
Yeah. Unfortunately, there isn't a school that I went to that's left.
yeah.
I went to for Seahome for 6 years, then to Franklin for 7th and 8th. And then they were very rigid in those days. Maple Street was the dividing line between Fairhaven and Whatcom. So all of us went to Fairhaven. And we would walk down to State Street, and for 2.5 cents we had these coupons. They would cost 2.5 cents in your book. We rode the streetcar over to Finnegan's Corner, get out and then walk to Fairhaven. Come back the same way, unless we walked a girl home after school.
It was Finnegan's Corner where the terminal building was, where Tony's Coffee is now.
That's right, that was Finnegan's
Because
Corner.
that was they called that the terminal building because that was the end of the line, wasn't it, or the turnaround point?
It did turn right and go down to the PAF.
Ah.
And then then another streetcar would go the other way out to Happy Valley.
Up Harris.
Yeah, up here to the very end.
Hmm.
But it was quite a means of transportation, and for 2.5 cents or 5 cents a day.
You know, I can even remember the streetcars. Maybe they were different streetcars, but I read in the paper just recently that the streetcars were taken out in 1930.
37, wasn't it?
7 or 8.
Yeah.
And I was born in 32, and I have a vague memory of riding on the streetcars.
You know, you could transfer and go all over town on those streetcars. One of them went clear to the end of Eldridge Avenue. And of course, you could transfer and go to Lake Whatcom out to Geneva. But on that run, they had a larger car. It was the only large car they had. The rest of them were all these small ones. And
Well, now let's talk about transportation for a moment, because your home was just uphill from the railroad station, the depot, the railroad depot, which was at the corner of Railroad and Maple. And do you remember that old building?
do I was in that building quite a bit. we used to use that building somewhat in our business after I took over.
Oh,
So you see, that building was, I took over the business in 1958. And we would hold occasional meetings in that building.
it was still there,
Yes,
but it was empty then?
empty, but in decent repair.
Huh. So that was built by the Bellingham Bay and British Columbia Railroad in oh dear, now it escapes me, 87, I think.
I think you're right.
And then as railroads bought up railroads, I'm sure the name changed many times, finally it was the Milwaukee,
Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific.
and you must have used that railroad a lot in your business.
We did. And we had spurs. In fact, we had 3 spurs. We had one from the NP, one from the Great Northern, and one from the Milwaukee.
Did they didn't all come here on separate tracks. They must have shared a track.
They did share it.
And then they split the side tracks that they took to a business were their own, huh?
That's correct.
I didn't know that.
The came up the waterfront in 1914, and that is into Bellingham. The NP was of which eventually was the NP, the Northern Pacific, is the one that went around Lake Whatcom.
Oh, it came up the Alger Valley and
Right.
down the Lake Whatcom shore
Yeah,
from Cedro Woolley.
from Cedar Woolley.
Ah,
That railroad is still existing, but it's not on Lake Whatcom now. It's further east, and it goes up through,
we used to go to Sumas.
through Nooksack and up to Sumas.
And then what was the third railroad?
And the third railroad was the Milwaukee. And the Milwaukee ran from Bellingham to the border, and then at the border at Blaine. I should say it's at Sumas. And then there it picked up, and a branch of the CPR met it and took it to Vancouver. And in 19 see, I was 13, 16. In 1917, my father took his whole family, that is my mother and my 2 brothers and myself. We got on the train at that Milwaukee station and went to Vancouver, and then took the CPR to Montreal, and then took a local down into Maine. And he took us back to see the farm.
Ah,
So I saw the farm at that time. Only time I'd ever.
did you have any family still living there?
Oh yes, oh yes.
I'll be darned.
His mother was still living, and she lived into her 90s, and he had an Aunt May, and she lived to be 93. So I had that, and I still have a faint remembrance of 1 or 2 things about that trip.
David, when you went, when you were a boy, I'm thinking back to the railroad's depot down on Maple and Railroad. When you were a boy, were they using horses down there?
Yes, they were. Horses were used a lot until
First World War, maybe?
about 1930, they began to taper off fast. But up until then, if you went down to Railroad Avenue from Hawley over to Magnolia, there were 2 lines of drays. That would be 2 horses and a wagon, some open, most of them covered. And they were lined up there, and they would wait for people to come along and hire them to move.
Really?
And they'd stand there all day until they got a hire. and there were two of them that there were two brothers that the whole town knew. They were called the Lampkin twins. They had black beards way down here, and wherever you saw them, everybody would say they're the Lampkin twins. And those horses would plod around and deliver. And the Blodell Donovan mill through Columbia Valley sold the short end wood that was of the scrap wood that was cut up into stove lengths, and they would deliver that not by truck but by these horses and wagon. And as kids, our house was heated with wood and coal. And
So it was called slab wood, wasn't it?
The slab wood was about 3 feet long, and that's was used more commercially into big furnaces.
Okay.
But for household use, it was 18-inch.
You know, I can still remember being hired by some of the people in the neighborhood. They'd get a big load of wood cut in about a foot and a half length, maybe,
Yeah.
and it'd be dumped out in their alley. And a lot of houses had a woodshed. And as a little kid, I'd get hired to throw the wood into the woodshed and stack it up. So that went on for a long time.
It sure did. Our summers as kids early on, until my mother converted it to oil. She had an Oil-O-Matic put in by Blythe. This wood would be hauled up there, and we would stack it against the fence in the alley to dry. Then just before school started, we had to put all that down the chute into the basement.
Yeah.
And then in the basement stack it up. And that basement it was a full-size basement under that house, plastered and everything. And we would stack that until you were just honeycombed in there.
And it smelled like a sawmill, didn't it? I can still remember the smell of that fir.
Of that fresh cut, yeah.
Yeah.
It was good.
Yeah, it was good.
Yeah.
So you got to look down as a boy on all the activity down there around that railroad station, and all the horses and people, steam engines. That must have been quite a sight.
Just behind the store and to the south of it, a half a block, was the Milwaukee Roundhouse, and they had a turntable there, and it was a well, the length of a railroad car or engine is what they turned, and they would put that on there and they'd push that by hand. It was that well balanced, and they'd push that and turn that engine around, and that hole and round table was there until way into the 40s and 50s before it was torn out.
And the hole was there. The hole was there just a few years ago.
Yeah, right.
I've seen that.
Yeah.
So I didn't know they pushed that by hand.
Yeah.
And of course they only had to turn the locomotives because the railroad cars would go either direction.
That's right. So they just had to turn the engine around.
Isn't that interesting?
And as a side light, Brian, the bank was right just beyond that, and then you went down that steep bank, and then you were at the edge of the salt water. People don't realize that whole pulp mill area and Morrison Mill that was there is all filled in. Well, as kids, we would go down that bank in the winter, and winters were colder, there's no question about it, and that water was stagnant, and so much rainwater that it was really mostly fresh water, and it would freeze, and we'd just get on that bank, we'd build a bonfire, and we would skate on that area.
Really?
And the only thing built in it was the wooden viaduct from the end of Dock Street that ran out to the municipal dock, which is now the port dock that's out here. But at that time there just was the one access, and that was that board viaduct to go out there. Well, the sport of this skating was that underneath that viaduct, it was a little bit warmer air, And so the ice didn't freeze as solidly, and we called it rubber ice. And you could skate, and you'd drip down, I'm sure, 6 inches or so between each bend.
Oh my.
And it was more darn fun to skate the area there.
Oh my.
That was another of our good memories.
Do you have any memories of Indians down along the shoreline?
No, I don't. The only memory I have of Indians is Indians would call at our house regularly every spring. They were really the Sumas Indians. Most of them came, I think, from across the line. And they would come, and they had their regular beat, and bring baskets. And knowing that my mother would save the kind of clothing that they wanted. And she would, and often I would sit there with her and hear this bargaining going on for a certain basket. And we have some of those baskets today, beautifully made.
Is that one of them?
No, that came from Alaska.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a wonderful story.
Yeah.
My grandparents were early people in Seattle. My grandfather was the first cigar maker in the territory of Washington, and he used to trade with the Indians, trade tobacco for baskets and things like that. And I have a little cedar canoe that he traded with the Indians. Nicely carved little thing.
Those are precious
Precious memories.
memories and mementos to have, I'll tell you.
Absolutely.
Right.
So you grew up, you went to Fairhaven High School then?
Right. Went to Fairhaven. I started there in 1926 and graduated in 1930. Made a lot of friends in Fairhaven, and they're mostly gone now, unfortunately, but through the years I've kept up a lot of friendships. I have an interesting picture that's on the wall just to your left there, that when they had this exhibit of Sandersons at the museum, Mike, our grandson, spied this picture down there. I hadn't seen it.
Oh, a treasure.
And it's our class of 1930, taken outside.
Oh my.
For what reason, I don't know. But I can later on go through those girls, and I can name all the girls for you. And
you can't remember all the boys though, huh?
Well, I can remember a lot of the boys too.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful.
It's a fine picture.
It really is indeed. Well,
Well, I'm going to go back and tell you a bit more about my mother, the way she raised us. She, as I said, devoted her whole life to us, and spared her own pleasures, because she was always home at night with us. And we had certain rituals, like Sunday night. We always had a fire in the fireplace, and had bread and milk. Loved it. And then she'd have a dessert for us. And then Easter, Easter was a big event for my mother to after we'd come home from church. She, before going to church, she would have this special Easter breakfast, and hot cross buns and eggs fixed a special way. Then have a ham dinner after we got home from church. And Christmas, of course, was a choice time, because with such a big house, we could devote almost a whole room just to the Christmas tree and your gifts and so on. So it kept the mess in one area. But those are memories that that stand out in your mind, because she made something of them very special for us. After high school, I went to the Bellingham Normal School for 1 year, and had gone to the university and asked and took the catalog down and had them check off subjects, courses that I could take that I would get full transfer credit. And this saved, of course, considerable money, because you could live at home and there was no tuition. The university was $15 a quarter.
Oh,
No tuition at the normal school that I can recall.
really?
And then I went to university, and from my sophomore year, starting in as a freshman down there, but as my sophomore year, I joined the Chi Psi fraternity, and it was a good fraternity. They were not a carousing bunch, and I made good friends there. It was a good place for me. But the depression kept getting deeper and deeper, and my mother had been well taken care of, but her investments that had been given were securities, and you know what happened to them during the Depression. And the only unhappiness that I can recall that really got bitter was during those few years of that Depression, the way she worried about raising her boys through school before the funds ran out. So I went to university for 2 quarters. Then I came home and took a quarter at the Bellingham Normal School. So I was able to get through my sophomore year that way. Then I went back to the U for my junior year, and senior year I went the fall quarter, and then stayed home for the winter quarter and worked. But I had to go back to school if I was to get a degree in the spring quarter, because you had to be in residence your last quarter if you wanted to get your degree. But as things turned out, that was the best thing in the world that could have happened to me. I had never worked at Morse Hardware Company, not a day. In fact, my mother's stock, she had sold to Cecil years before. And so here I was going to stay home. And so I went down to the store and talked to Jack Bates. He was the sales manager. And I knew him quite well. And my mother knew the family. Anyway, I asked Jack if I could, I knew that they hired extra hands to take inventory. So I asked him if I could get a job doing that. He said, "I'll see." So he saw the right powers. I'm sure he had to cover it with Cecil. And so I took inventory there for 2 weeks. And I was fascinated with that handling of the physical handling of all that merchandise, not knowing how to use any of those tools, but each one caused my curiosity and so on. And of course I got acquainted with a lot of the guys at the store, and it was I was just really kind of in a new heaven. So then I went to Cecil and I said, "Cecil, I'd like to stay here and work this next spring quarter if I may." And he hired me, and I worked for 35 cents an hour. That's how I got started at the store. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been there. I had always wanted to be a banker, and at the university I took banking as my specialty. And in our fraternity house was a fellow by the name of Bacchus. Bacchus's grandfather had started the National Bank of Commerce. And Bacchus had taken me to his home out in the Highlands several times. So I thought through Bacchus I could probably get a job. I had never asked him, but I felt I could work that. But I wanted to be a banker. But this type of work suited me really far better, and in the long run I can see where I was much happier in this where I eventually became the head guy and could own the business, which was my goal after I'd been there a short time. I had set a goal in my own mind that someday I'm going to own this business.
But you started with your mother and your family didn't have any ownership when you started.
We had no ownership.
Cecil owned it all.
Cecil owned 2/3 and Charlie owned 1/3.
Ah. How much older was Cecil than you?
Cecil was 33 years older.
Oh my. Oh, more than a generation and a half older.
He really was, yeah. That's right. So you can understand how people could not really grasp that he was a brother, a half-brother, rather than my father, which he was not. Yeah.
Sure, he could well have been your father.
Yeah, that's right. It would have fitted
Yeah.
the time schedule a lot better.
Yeah. So you eventually did graduate from the University of Washington.
I graduated in 1934, got what was termed a BBA degree. In those days they called it a Bachelor of Business Administration. I think today it would just be a BA. But yeah, I got my degree. And so I started working full-time July 1st on 1934.
And had you met Joyce by this time?
I met Joyce when I didn't know her in high school. I was going to the Bellingham Normal, and she was a senior at Watcom. And believe it or not, Kate Blythe, who had gone with Stu Blythe for Kate Spencer had gone with Stu Blythe for a long time.
And Stu was a boyhood friend of yours.
Yeah, right. He was 1 year younger than I am, and he'd graduated from university too. 1 year after I did. Anyway, they'd had a little spat, and Kate was having a party at her house, and so she asked me for her date instead of Stu. And at that party, I met Joyce.
Was she with Stu?
No, I don't know who she was with. That would have been something.
That would have been the perfect flip-flop.
Stu wasn't there, I don't think.
He was on the outs.
I never thought of that. I should ask her. Maybe she'll tell me. But anyway, that's where I met Joyce.
Ah.
And I frankly have never really had any dating other than with Joyce since that time. And then she was 1 year behind me. And she went to university. She went to the normal school for 1 year too, after high school. And then at the university, she was a Gamma Phi Beta in a sorority and graduated in 35. And we were married on August 31st in 1935.
And what was Joyce's maiden name?
Her maiden name was Fuller. Now her father had come here from Wenatchee and started the automotive parts service on State Street across from the stage depot.
That her brother carried on for many years.
That's right. And now his son is running the business.
Oh, the business is still there.
Oh yes. And then his son. So the great grandson is in the business too.
Amazing.
Yeah. And now it's interesting how that name is spelled. Mr. Fuller, his name is Ernest, came from Saxony, Germany. And that's another story, but he was shipped over here when he was 7 years old. Couldn't speak a word of English. And it was an unbelievable story. But anyway, the name is spelled Pfueller, because that's the German Fuller, but it's pronounced Fuller when it's Americanized.
And so do the Fullers now spell it
Pfueller.
Still the same way.
You bet.
You know, it occurred to me, David, when you mentioned the normal school, for those people who might be listening to this years past, we should clarify that Western Washington University is now what used to be the normal school.
You're so right, yeah. And actually, the name was the Bellingham Normal School. Then it became the State Normal School. And then, in a good many years later, it became Western Washington College of Education.
Yep.
And then eventually became Western Washington University.
Right.
Been a lot of changes there.
Right. Right.
Well,
What?
then,
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that at Morse Hardware, I took a stock. That was the way the inventory was kept on cards. And I'm ahead of myself. I worked in the shipping department for the first year, filling orders. And that was right, because you learn the merchandise, you learn where it was, but you learn the merchandise. Handling a certain Bernard plier for 100 times during the year, you better know what that plier's used for. And that's the way it was with all the tools. Then the second year, I was, what I say, graduated up to the purchasing department, and I took stock on inventory cards. And these were records on which the buyer then was able to place an order. And it was all handwork, but it was very efficient and people used to say to me, how do you know what you got here? You got thousands of stuff. Well, every item was on those cards until it was closed out and sold out. And then it would be crossed out, and then when a new car was made, that would be eliminated. But it was a real control until we computerized. And we computerized that business in 1973. And that was tough going, as it was for any business, but it was. Well, after working there for a year, you may or may not recall that Morse Hardware was really wholesale, but the doors were open for retail.
I do recall.
And
To selected people who...
Well, to anybody who wanted to walk in.
Really?
But it was a mixed mass, because we had stuff in warehouses across the alley. We had 3 floors of inventory, and of course everybody would. I mean, when you took an order or people wanted something, you didn't know where it was. That is, they wouldn't, and you'd be gone for 2 minutes or 3 minutes chasing up the stairs to get that. Well, of course, from a retail point of view, that service was terrible, and we had a terrible name. People, that's the way they categorized Morse Hardware, was this slow service. But here we were given retail service in a wholesale setup. Of course, a lot of the orders that we would take would be, maybe you'd be with a man for 30, 40 minutes, taking an order, be a dealer, and you'd just write the order, and then you'd send it down to the shipping department to be filled. But these people that wanted something...
Came in for a jackknife, and
yeah,
it was up on the 3rd floor.
And a jackknife was a big sale for them. They would come in for a few machine screws because they wanted to repair something.
Oh dear.
But anyway, Jack Bates got Cecil to put me in charge of the floor, and I really kind of reorganized it. I brought down merchandise that was selling the most into the lower levels. That was one thing. And then I kept the men a little more on their feet than they had been. They hadn't had much supervision. Anyway, we did the best we could, and we did improve the service a lot. I was very proud of it because I knew if it was going right, or if it wasn't. But it was, you wore your legs out, because there was hardly an order that you didn't have to go to the top floor. And we were one of the main sources of household goods in those days. and all the housewares were on the very top floor
Oh my.
because they were light weight,
Ah.
and you didn't have the weight. But anyway, that's just one of the things that took place. So I was running I managed that sales floor area until 1939, when the war broke out. And in just a matter of a few short months, the supply of merchandise coming into the business just began to just trickle. There was so little of it. You place an order and you got very little of it shipped. Only if they had surplus, you might say. Because everything had started to be on a rationing basis, and you had to have a priority. The common priority was A10, and that people would, if a person was going to replace something that was essential, like a tank, that was considered essential.
A hot water tank.
Well, I'm thinking of like a tank for diesel for your home heating.
Oh, you sold those too.
Well, yeah, we did.
Huh.
Or a septic tank. You could get an A10 for that, but we couldn't get a replacement on an A10 when we would pass that on to the manufacturer. He had too much business that was a higher priority of other natures for more material and so on. So we were just going down like that. So Conrad Barker was always one to be very much aware of trends and more far-sighted and willing to act on it, try it. So he one day came down to me and said, "You're going to go outside and be our salesman to the war industry." Well, boy, that was something for me, that I jumped at the chance.
Yeah.
Should we take a break now, or is this?
Do you want to?
No, it isn't
Well, I'm
necessary
fine.
for me.
No, we're doing fine. I just wanted to be sure we still had.
Great.
We're doing great.
So I started out calling on the war industries. We had the Bellingham shipyards that was getting started, and we had a salesman calling there, but we were getting, maybe 3,000 a month. And the Bellingham Machine Works in the south side, that later became owned by Talbot too, was just a beehive of items that we sold, but we weren't getting that business. Now when they would place an order, we would get it on a requisition sheet, and it would have a AA1. That was the highest priority. If they were selling that or making it for Bremerton or someplace like that, which was most of the stuff that they were doing. So we could replace it with a AA1. Well, I'll never forget, Conrad came to me, and after the second month, we'd gone from 2,000 to 5,000 in our monthly sales at the Bellingham Iron Works. So that gave you an idea how, and I just loved it. And I had nothing to do except that. Well, pretty soon I found out that I was also become a buyer. Our buyer, I'd come back with all these strange things to buy, and gosh, he would he would look at them, and maybe a week later I'd still see it on his desk. He hadn't written a letter to see if he could find it or where it could be bought and so on. So I finally, without saying anything, started doing my own buying. And that increased our sales a terrific amount. Eventually, I was selling to 13 shipyards in our area. Now these were all wooden shipyards. They were building big barges in Anacortes. Some were on Guimas Island. I went as far south as Everett, and Everett had a lot of shipbuilding going on. and it was much more competitive in Everett because it was closer to the Seattle people. But it was a worthwhile call. I would only go there about every other week. But these other places I'd be in almost daily. Like I had a routine at here at these local ones every day. So in a very short time, our receiving department was a beehive of activity. There was so much more material coming in because of the AA1 priority. So that was a real education. I'll never forget it. And that's a business that I did until 1943, when I got tapped to go in the into the military. And my number was, of course, it was on a drawing basis, but I figured I couldn't afford to go in as a private, just on the draft. So I went down to Seattle and inquired, and I could get a direct commission in the Navy. They would take anybody that had an education and had 2 feet.
And some experience.
Yeah. For the amphibious warfare, because that was the main way of. Well, it was where they used a great number of personnel in the service, because all of the island hopping that they did in the Pacific, overcoming what the Japanese had taken. So I got a direct commission in 1943, but I wasn't called up until 1944, and then I was called into the service, and I went from Bellingham to Tucson for 2 months.
In the Navy?
In the Navy.
Tucson, Arizona.
That was they called it the good ship bear down. We lived in the gymnasium, and boy, they put us through the traces. It was elementary stuff, but they just crammed it into you, rote memory, and you had to pass or you would lose your commission. But nobody did because they needed you too much. But they had that threat. Al McNeil did the same thing just 1 month later. So we were in Tucson together for 1 month because it's only a 2-month indoctrination. Then I was transferred to Miami into anti-submarine school. And believe it or not, Al was transferred there too 1 month later.
Your boyhood friend.
Yeah, that's right. So when we got to Miami, the Flamingo Hotel was a quarters where you could have family, and I applied there, and luckily there was a vacancy, and so I was able to get Joyce down there, but to get her there was another problem. So my brother was in the Air Force, and he was at the Homestead Air Base, which is near Miami. So I went over to him and talked to him, and he said, "I'll get you on a plane out of here." So I went over there. First of all, there was a certain kind of leave, they called it, but they gave me 10 days leave. So I went to my brother, and I sat there, and about 10 o'clock that night, he got me on a plane. And it went to Kansas City. No, it went to Knoxville. And then I slept overnight, and the rest of the night at Knoxville. And then the next day they said, "There are no planes going to the West Coast here for several days. We do have one plane going to Great Falls, Montana. But they said it's tough getting out of there."
I bet.
I said, "I'll take it." So I took that plane to Montana. And then the next day, believe it or not, there was a a B-17 that had been there, and it was going into Seattle. Want me to slow up
No,
here?
no, no, right. Keep going.
So I said I'll go with that. Well, that was the toughest ride in my life.
A B-17.
There were no seats. You just sat in the back of the plane. You sat on there were sort of metal buckets that you sat on, but no heat. I got into Seattle, and I bummed up to Bellingham. I just bummed my way, and then Joyce and I started the next day with the two boys and drove to Miami and got it within 10 days. So it was an experience, but
How old were the boys?
well,
Not very.
they weren't very old.
4 or 5?
About 3 and 5, I'd say.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pat stayed home, and so because she was in school, and stayed with Mrs. Fuller, Joyce's mother. So that worked out very well.
I should say.
Yeah.
So then, did they ever send you overseas?
I went through this anti-submarine school, and at the same time learned navigation and whatever else was essential. But when it came time, which was at Christmas or at Christmas vacation time, you could put in your choice because that's when you're going to be transferred for your future permanent duty. Well, I put in for armed guard, I think. Anyway, I was shoved into amphibious warfare. So I was transferred to Norfolk, Virginia, to Camp Bradford, which was called the hellhole of the East Coast, and it was. But anyway, I was started in school, and I was only in school 3 days. On the third day, a messenger came to the door and interrupted the instructor and asked for Ensign Morse. My commission was an ensign. So I went to the executive office with this messenger. Well, Camp Bradford was no place to have a family, and we found a little shack on the beach, and I could put Joyce and the 2 children there while I was in school. One day somebody came to the door while I was in school and said to Joyce, "There's going to be an inspector come by here tomorrow, and if you complain, I'm going to put you out at the end of this week." They were just checking to see how well the military people were being taken care of. So of course nobody complained, and that's what we put up with until I was moved into Norfolk proper. And in Norfolk proper, they had billets where the family could stay, only temporarily, because I was going to be going overseas. And so we were there together. I could go home at night as long as there were no orders to go. But one day the captain said to me, "You better say goodbye to your wife," because he said, "We're getting very close to when we're going to go, and when we go, you may not be able to go and say goodbye." So I said goodbye to Joyce that night, and she started driving home with those 2 boys. And I was on the ship, and the ship left about 2 days later. And it was interesting because I knew where Joyce was going to make one stop. It was a sorority sister of hers that lived in Indiana. And so that night before we left, I called that number, and by gosh, Joyce was there. What a break. But she got home okay. She took care of herself with the 2 boys, but that wasn't easy. And so we left. Our ship took off and went through the canal. And I was the sickest guy in the world those first 8 days getting to the canal. I was seasick the whole time. I was so sick that when we got to the canal, I was in a state of state of mind to jump ship. And I'm not that kind.
You're not that kind of guy.
But it was unbearable. But I went ashore in Panama. On the Pacific side, we went straight through, and walked one night, and walked, and I got into a military a canteen, and I went up to the counter, and there was a sergeant there. I guess he could see how green looking I was, and he said, "Sir, let me buy you a milkshake." And you know, I said, I would sure appreciate that. So he bought me a milkshake, and that sort of got my stomach settled.
Really?
And then I walked, and I walked into they had a mountain there, and an officer could do these things. And so I walked into that tunnel and got into the middle of that mountain, and that was their command headquarters. But there was one place where it said communication, so I went into there, and for 50 cents, I could take number 1, 2, 3 up to 10, and just say, I want to send number 5. And so I sent that message home to Joyce, just like it was a personal a telegram.
Oh, it was the number of the
Yeah.
message. The message number 5 had said
right.
certain things.
That's right.
I see.
I'm fine. I hope you're well, and
Yeah.
I love you.
Right.
I hope, and I'll see you So that's the way it was. So I sent a message home, and that made me feel good. Well, of course, I was back on the ship that night about 3 o'clock in the morning, and we took off the next morning, or that morning, for Honolulu. And then after Honolulu, we had no escort, and we had one hair-raising experience when we met a Japanese surface ship that was a raider, but we were too small fry for the raider, I guess.
Mm.
Anyway, we made it fine to Pearl, and then from Pearl, we were in a group of 12, and that is 12 LSTs, and we went to Eniwetok, Guam, Saipan, and then we're there for the invasion of Okinawa.
Really?
And the interesting thing, we were sitting in Rotary one day, talking to Bob Mould next to him, and he was telling me, I don't know how it came up, but something about being in Okinawa. I said, Okinawa, when were you there? Well, he said, I was there for the invasion, and I was there too. and neither one of us ever knew that until that was a couple years ago that we learned that.
You know, Bob, when I interviewed Bob,
Yes.
he told me his story about the beach at Okinawa. He was in charge of the ammo, one of the ammo dumps. He was an ammo officer. But he was on a landing ship that made a feint. And they went to the north end of the island, or where the battle wasn't the worst, to draw the Japanese troops over there, and they had this whole landing force up there. They all got in their landing boats, and they went towards the beach. They got 2/3 of the way to the beach, turned around, came back, loaded on the ships, and went back to the other end.
That was quite a feint, all right.
Strange. So you were on the ship. You didn't have to land on the beach.
Yes, we did.
Ooh.
Oh yes, we had to go in on the beach when it came our turn. And as we were unloading, as you know, an LST has the big bow ramp, and so we had cargo. The whole lower area was full, and then there was machinery on the deck itself. So we were unloading when there was a red alert. Now this is at the very start, we hadn't unloaded very much, and the red alert meant that there was an actual flight of enemy airplanes. So you close the bow door as quickly as you can and stand by. Everybody at general quarters with their guns ready. And there were 4 kamikazes that came over. You could see them, and 3 of them apparently chickened out and went back over the hill. This 4th one, you could see him way in the distance, and he kept coming right towards us. And the battleships and the cruisers, everything was firing at this thing, at this one plane. But as it got lower and lower, the firing ceased because the shells were coming too close to the ships in the landing. And it was so quiet. It was just deathly quiet after all this firing that there had been, and then none. And that plane kept coming right straight for us. And finally, I have never been sure, and perhaps shouldn't say it, but I don't think our gunnery officer gave the order to commence firing. I had my earphones, I had my station on the stern, and I never got an order. But anyway, one of our, well, in fact it was our gunner right above me, who opened fire, and he hit the wing of that plane. So it just tipped it, you could see it splatter. And that diverted him, because the ship next to us was not firing. And he changed and went right straight for the water line of that ship next to us, which was about 300 yards from us. And boom, with his bomb aboard. And that ship was on the beach too, but of course it sunk the ship and just settled the whole ship in. Well, unfortunately, and the only person that was killed on that was the beachmaster, and it was the 3rd beachmaster in 3 days that had been killed. The beachmaster's in charge of all of the landing, directing it. He had stepped inside of the other LST, inside the tank to have cover. Well, of course, when it hit the water line, that
He was in the wrong place.
He was in the wrong place. Well, immediately they wanted that ship to get out of there, to try and repair it. And they put welders aboard, but to get down into the tank deck, the lower deck, they had to cut through the upper deck. And in doing so, the diesel tanks had ruptured. So the hot
acetylene torches?
spline, I think they call it, from welding, dripped down and caught that, and that was a blazing ship within just a matter of a couple of minutes. Well, then we had to send all of our gear over there to help fight that. And their men were occupied throwing all of the ammunition overboard. They didn't want that to explode. So they were doing that, and we were trying to put the fire out for them. Well, right during that happening, a LCI, that's another landing craft that carries infantry, put its nose right next to the side of our ship, right under the con, where you direct the ship. and I was the officer of the day at the moment. And the guy yelled up there and said, "Is David Morse aboard that?"
No.
It was Paul Williams. I don't know if you knew Paul Williams or not, but Paul Williams had married Helen Stark of the Stark Piano Company here
Oh
in
my
Bellingham.
gosh.
And he was a doctor,
Bert
but
Starks.
he could tell my voice.
Ah.
And I looked at him and I said, "Paul, later on you and I can get together, but right now I'm pretty busy."
Oh gosh.
I did see him later in Honolulu, but I didn't see him anymore there. But anyway, that was a tough experience. Well, we were there for a long period of time, and every day we were sent on a mission. We would take ducks, their craft that can land, that go on water or land, either one. We would take a whole load of them up behind the lines, and then they would go in and come from behind. Or we would take tanks, or we would take a whole shipload of Marines and put them somewhere on the island. We did that for a month steady. One of those times we had a whole load of ducks, and we went into a narrow passageway like a fjord, and it kept getting narrower and narrower, and there was no way that we could turn around. It was so narrow, and the orders were to land at a certain point. Well, when you looked at that place to land, there was a hill just straight like this. But we hit the beach, or hit the side of that as we were supposed to. And the moment we hit that, there was an explosion that knocked me flat on the deck. The Marines were there, and they didn't want to open that opening until we were there. And so they blew that whole side of that hill, so there was a passageway for these ducks to go through.
Oh, for goodness sake.
But we had no information on that. This was just a...
So there's this huge explosion and the hill went away.
And it was the right thing, but we had no knowledge of it. But the concussion, I'll never forget. I was in the stern of the ship in general quarters, and I was in charge of the stern anchor. And that gear, I took to it like a duck. It was just like a huge fishing reel with your star drag.
Yeah.
And you could be letting it out, but yet you could be winding it in. I mean, you could be letting out cable. It was a 2-inch galvanized cable, wire rope. So of course I had dropped the stern anchor on the way in when I was given the order to by the captain. So when we backed out, I had to raise this stern anchor, but we had to back way out because it was so narrow. Well, I would get that stern anchor up to the surface, and I couldn't get it above. I couldn't get it above. It had caught on a submarine cable. This was actually a submarine base for the Japanese.
Ah.
But eventually, what I did was I got it up, and then I put it in neutral, let it drop fast, and I dropped it. The anchor I got to drop faster than the wire, and I freed it from that thing. So we backed out and got turned around, and we're at the opening of this fjord when we met head on a Japanese submarine
Coming back.
on the surface. Because he was coming in and it was too shallow apparently for him to, well, of course he dove immediately. And we didn't attempt to put a depth bomb, but we notified the headquarters, and they sent a DE, which was a destroyer escort, out to see if they could find it. But that's the kind of work we did there. Then at night was the most horrible situation. We had to make smoke. Buckner Bay was a huge bay, and it was just filled with ships. And these kamikazes would come in and strike a ship at night. So they made smoke so they couldn't see the ships. And smoke is nothing more than diesel. It's not completely burned, so it's oily, and everything on your ship is just dripping with that oil. But they can't see you. But sometimes these kamikazes would still come in, and they would fly just above the water level until they hit something.
Oh.
And this was the most nerve-wracking
Oh.
thing. One night we heard this plane, and we could hear it coming closer and closer and closer, and we just knew that it was coming right at us. And then it, just like that, you didn't hear anything. Well, the next morning that plane was about 150, 200 yards broad side from us, upside down. It had hit the water before it got there.
It was floating in the water?
And it was floating. So much for that.
Ah.
But anyway, after the war was over, we went all through the South Pacific, picking up Japanese soldiers, what they called a repatriatee.
Really?
And we would take 300 at a time and bring them back to Yokohama and put them. They never would allow American ship into the actual docks at the harbor. They didn't want the Japanese people to see this. So that we had to unload them onto barges. Then they would tow the barge in and take them off. But those men were scared to death at first. They thought we were taking them back to be shot, to be executed. But
by the Japanese, you mean?
no, by
By
the Americans.
Americans.
Yeah, that's the way it was.
Yeah.
Well, on one of these trips, we were waiting in the Manila Bay, and here Al McNeil was on his ship in Manila Bay, and that's another story. But Al and I got together there, and
Was he on the same kind of ship?
no, he was on and he was properly placed. He was on a repair tug called an ATR, and they made those here in Bellingham.
Oh,
a
for
few of
goodness
those.
sake.
But he was on this salvage vessel, and they would raise ships to clear areas that were needed and so on like that. But that was a very interesting thing.
Isn't that a strange coincidence?
Yeah. So after, but I saw a lot of the Pacific on that duty. I remember going on Ieshima, and that's where Ernie Pyle was shot by a sharpshooter, and they buried him right where he had fallen. And of course the grave was well marked, but there were other graves too. But they buried him right where he fell. After the war, they removed all of those bodies to a regular American cemetery. So anyway, we eventually got orders to go back to Honolulu to get loaded for the Kuriles. That was our next assignment, and the Kuriles was one of the jumping off areas for the invasion of Japan itself. But thank heavens that didn't take place.
The Kuriles were islands to the north of Japan, are they not?
Yeah, at the very end of the Aleutian chain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you once again, Bob Moles was sent to Saipan, ready to train for the invasion of Japan, and so the atomic bomb may well have saved both of you.
Oh, there's no question about it. There is no question about it. It saved 1 million lives. Yeah. We were the second ship, the second American ship to go into Nagasaki after the war. And we were escorted in there with a British cruiser, beautiful ship. and there was an APA ahead of us that was already there. That's attack transport. But so we saw Nagasaki just as it was after the bomb.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
Anyway, I had a acute appendicitis when I was on our ship, and fortunately we were carrying a psychiatrist with a group of people to this was after the war, of course, after the armistice, and this group of people was to go into a certain place, and why they wanted a psychiatrist, I don't know. Anyway, being a doctor, he wouldn't operate, he said, because he wasn't skilled for that. But he aborted it with overdoses of sulfa, so I was okay.
Hmm.
But I had to come home on a ship that was